Hi all, just we're still waiting just to allow a couple more people to get on board, those who may not already have the GoToMeeting system installed, and we'll get started just in about 1 minute here. Okay, all right. I think I'll get started. So first, just welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited for, it's going to be a great event with a lot of Fulbright China, Fulbright Hong Kong, Fulbright Macau alumni on this call, also some people interested in Fulbright, and also special thanks to our special guests who are involved in on Capitol Hill and also who have been involved in Fulbright administration or are currently involved in Fulbright administration. We're really glad to have you as well. I'm going to turn over to my fellow organizer, co-organizer Erica, to give some housekeeping information.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So a couple housekeeping items. This is being recorded. We will be sharing this recording with you after the event, along with a few other items. If you do
Hey, Ned, can you hear Erica or did we lose her?
I think I just lost Erica. I don't think we can hear you right now. Yeah. Can people hear me right now?
Yes, we could hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'll go ahead and take sort of pick up from it. Just to start off, this event is being recorded. We will be sharing the recording after the event. If you don't wish to be recorded, please exit the meeting. Also, please remember to stay on mute if you're not speaking. Erica will help to monitor technical issues, so please feel free to message her or Brian Sway or Rachel Wong, also the organizers, and they will respond to chat messages. So Rachel, while we're waiting for Erica to come back on, do you want to introduce Lotus and your role?
Yeah, sounds good. So hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I am the communications director for Fulbright Lotus. We are an affinity group for Asian and Asian American Fulbrighters, and this was founded by Tang Mai and Amika Rapadas last year in 2019. In terms of things that we do, so on the termination of Fulbright China, we were the ones that helped organize logistics to form an action group last July, and we also were like the liaison to help start the change.org petition. And right after that, we joined forces with Fulbridge, which Erica will talk a little bit about later, to co-host this two-part panel series. In terms of other things that Fulbright Lotus do, we also share resources and information with Fulbrighters abroad, as well as to prepare them for their Fulbright grants. And on social media channels, so on Instagram, on our Slack channels and things like that, we also regularly spotlight Fulbrighters. And I'll let our other Lotus board member introduce himself, Brian.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. I'm Brian. I was in ETA to Hong Kong last year, and I'm the Internal Affairs Director of Fulbright Lotus. And our ways to connect with us, Fulbright Lotus and Fulbridge will be provided at the very last slide. And I think Erica now has returned from the tundra of Wi-Fi. So I'll turn it back over to her to introduce Fulbridge.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Sorry about about that. I think we've all experienced technical issues during this time period. So my name is Erica. I work with community engagement activities for Fulbridge. So just a bit of background on who Fulbridge is. It is an online platform to engage with grantees and alumni, and was founded in 2015 by Zoe Joya while she was on her ETA grant to South Korea. So we have a team of current grantees and alumni who work on active engagement activities and community building, such as this panel. And after the termination of the Fulbright program in China, Fulbridge and Fulbright Lotus came together to find ways to highlight the programs and advocacy efforts to reinstate the program. And with that, I believe I'll be handing it over to Ned to take it away.
Yeah, sure. Actually, and Nick, did you want to say anything before we get started?
Yeah, I can really quickly. My name is Nick. I'm also an organizer behind the events. I did my ETA in Macau 2 years ago, and looking forward to hearing everybody on the panel. Back to you, Ned.
Great. Okay. Thank you all so much. I'm going to so my name's Edmund Downey, or you can call me Ned. I am a non-resident fellow at the Columbia University SIPA Center for Global Energy Policy, and I was a Fulbright China student researcher in 2017, 2018 at Yunnan University. I'm going to give a brief 10-minute overview of the Fulbright program, the key institutions that are involved in authorizing and administering Fulbright, so that we can all be on the same page. And then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. We have 5 panelists here today who are going to talk about their experiences working on advocacy for Fulbright. And then we'll end it with a Q&A session where we can have a broader discussion about advocacy steps for the new administration and lessons from prior advocacy efforts as well. To start, I'm not an international exchange professional myself, or somebody who's worked on Fulbright in any professional capacity. The presentation here is, all based on information that I and my fellow organizers and panelists have learned as we've been involved in advocacy work. So we want to share our collective knowledge, and we would love more of your collective knowledge as well as we think about what we can do to bring this program back. So let me start by introducing our panelist team. So Haiqing Yang is a Fulbright China student researcher from 2006 to 2007 at Tsinghua University in Beijing. She's currently senior corporate counsel for Coursera as lead attorney for all US and international government contracting and corporate matters for the Middle East and Asia. Mark Liang is currently an analyst at the Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine. He was a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Macau in 2019-2020, where he taught nursing students and intercultural communications. Kurt Mosser teaches philosophy at the University of Dayton in Ohio, specializing in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In 2020, he taught at Suzhou University in Jiangsu Province as a Fulbright scholar. Elizabeth Lynch is an attorney in New York and was a Fulbright China student researcher in 1999-2000 in Beijing. For much of her career, she was a legal services attorney and continues to work in consumer protection, which was her focus in her current role in state government. In her free time, she's the founder and editor of the blog China Law and Policy. And lastly, James Carrico is an architect in Boston, working at Gamble Associates, a small urban design consulting firm. This past spring, he was awarded a Fulbright student researcher grant to Hong Kong, just months prior to the termination of the Fulbright Hong Kong exchange. He's since relocated his grant to Singapore, which, due to COVID delays, is scheduled to commence in July. So I will start with a quick outline of my presentation. I'll begin by giving a brief overview of the Fulbright program. Then I'll move to discussing the key institutions that authorize, fund, and administer the Fulbright program. And then I'll turn it over to our panelists to share their experiences in advocating for the program. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box. We will have a time at the end of, after the panel presentation, where we should have time for more Q&A. So basics on the Fulbright. I think a lot of our audience already know these things, but just to go over again, the Fulbright program was established first in 1946 by a bill sponsored by Senator William J. Fulbright of Arkansas. His legacy is a complex one. He's best known for the Fulbright program. He led its development in the aftermath of World War II as part of a vision for fostering world peace. Senator Fulbright was also a staunch segregationist, as were many of his fellow Southern Democrats, and he voted against every major civil rights legislation bill during the 1960s. The modern day Fulbright program covers a whole wide range of international academic, teaching, and research exchange programs between the US and 160 plus countries worldwide. Most of these exchanges are targeted at recent graduates, PhD students, and scholars with PhDs in the US and abroad. In total, there have been 400,000 grants, more than 400,000 grants, sponsored under Fulbright programs since 49, with 8,500 plus of those going to for Fulbright China. Most of those exchanges have been since 1979, after the normalization of US relations with the People's Republic of China. But one cool fact about Fulbright China is that the Republic of China, the PRC's predecessor, was one of the first 3 countries to receive Fulbrighters in 1948, in the middle of the Chinese Civil War. You can read about that more on the blog of one of our panelists, Elizabeth Lynch. The key questions that I want to address in this presentation are as follows. First, how are Fulbright exchanges authorized under US law? Second, how are they funded? And third, how are they administered? And I think by presenting those, I think we can give the background knowledge that can help us inform a discussion of how effective advocacy might look about restoring Fulbright China. So start with authorization. The Fulbright program, as we discussed earlier, includes a whole host of different exchange programs. These programs have been established collectively by the Department of State and the Department of Education on congressional legislative authorization. As I mentioned, the first of the exchanges began in the late 1940s with authorization through legislation led by Senator Fulbright at a time when the US government's citizen exchange programs were very limited. The 1940s and 1950s saw the gradual buildup of legislative authorization for the executive branch to sponsor and fund these kinds of citizen exchanges. And the culminating act in this process, and it's still core to this architecture of government-sponsored exchange, is the Mutual Education and Cultural Exchange Act of 1961. It's widely known as the Fulbright-Hayes Act of 1961, after its 2 sponsors, Senator Fulbright and Representative Wayne Hayes of Ohio. This act consolidated much of the existing legislation around international exchange and strengthened legislative authorization around these exchange programs. And so when we talk about the legislative authorization for Fulbright today, the most important item is the Fulbright-Hayes Act. Funding for Fulbright comes from a variety of sources. Around 70% in total is through the US government. The bulk of that is from congressional budget allocations. So that's explicit line items in federal appropriations for the executive branch set up by Congress. In 2016, that was around $240 million, so around 60% of overall funding for Fulbright programs. There's also a small chunk from the US Agency for International Development that appears to be, to our understanding, program specific, as opposed to, or determined by program budgets by the agency, as opposed to congressional allocation. But really the bulk of the funding is congressional allocation. The next largest chunk is foreign government funding, which covers around 20% of all Fulbright funding. And the last 10% comes from US and foreign private contributions. Some updated information about congressional allocations for the Department of State and Department of Education in Fulbright programs. You can see that congressional allocations for both in 2021 saw a modest increase. Department of State had an inflationary increase. It was effectively flat at around $270 million. Department of Education, whose funding needs are much more limited, they got a bit of an increase for Fulbright-Hayes grants. We don't have information on other sources, in part because the funding information that we shared before from 2016, that's collected and publicized through the Fulbright Foreign Scholarships Board's annual report. And the board has not published this annual report, though it is congressionally mandated to do so. It hasn't published it since 2017. Now, for Fulbright China specifically, the US government in 2016 provided about $5.5 million for the program, and the Chinese government provided $1.4 million for the program. Okay, so that's the funding circumstance. Now, how is Fulbright administered? So the answer is that administration takes place through the executive branch, the US Departments of State and Education, the primary receivers of and dispersers of Fulbright funding, working in coordination with host country governments. So we have a diagram up here that describes the basic administrative structure. On the US side, at least formally speaking, the senior supervisory board for the program, as established by Congress, is the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, which is a 12-member board that has final responsibility for grantee selection and program supervision. Program execution is the responsibility of the Department of State, specifically its Bureau for Educational and Cultural Affairs. And that's for most Fulbright grants. For Fulbright Hayes exchanges, it's the Department of Education. In terms of in-country work, the U.S. Department of State and Department of Education, they coordinate with either local U.S. embassies or U.S. representatives on bilateral Fulbright commissions that have been set up between the U.S. and 49 host countries. And then actual nitty-gritty program administration in many countries is contracted out to private nonprofits. So you've got those 4 layers on the U.S. side. So in China, for instance, where many of us will have had experience, there's no Fulbright commission, so no bilateral Fulbright commission. The key local U.S. government representatives are from the embassy, and then program administration itself for the student exchanges that myself and a number of us have on this call participated in, it's handled by the Institute for International Education, which is, or IIE, and that's a nonprofit. And then, of course, there are the corresponding host country institutions with whom the U.S. liaises. So in China, that's the primary local authority involved in Fulbright administration is the China Scholarship Council under the Chinese Ministry of Education. So that's the backdrop. That's how Fulbright China has been happening. As many of you already know, and this is what we've come to talk about, in July 2020, former President Trump issued an executive order on Hong Kong normalization that ended US preferential treatment of Hong Kong in response to the new national security law for Hong Kong that had been established by Chinese authorities this past summer. It also included a seemingly unrelated provision that called upon the Department of State to, quote, take steps to terminate the Fulbright exchange programs with the PRC. So that's Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China. Those Fulbright grantees to China who at that point had been given awards for 2020-21 were allowed to reapply, to redirect the grants to other countries. My understanding is that almost everyone, if not everyone, has been able to do so and is set to start their grants this year, COVID allowing. But no Fulbright grants were offered in 2021-22 between the US and the PRC. So I'm going to turn to our panelists, a few things to, for framing the discussion here, and I think important things to keep in mind. The first is that this was, the termination of Fulbright China was an executive branch action. It was an executive order from the White House directing the Department of State to do certain things. It did not take place by congressional action. Now, Congress has authorized the establishment of Fulbright through the Fulbright Hayes Act, and it annually explicitly funds programs with appropriations. And so there is a natural way in which Congress might take an interest in and theoretically seek to act upon program terminations. And they have included some new language in the latest appropriations bill, actually, to that effect. Not about Fulbright China, but more generally about program termination and what's required of the administration, an executive branch body, if it wishes to do that. But the most direct route to changing the program, restoring Fulbright China, is through the executive branch. And we have a new administration now and an opportunity to maybe make some more progress. Second, the executive order called upon the Department of State to begin to, quote, take steps to terminate. Now, we know, as I said, that they have not taken new grantees. But consider that termination also involves reallocating personnel who are dedicated to Fulbright China, for instance, adjusting internal budgets. There is an internal administrative side to termination. To our knowledge, the scaffolding of Fulbright China within the Department of State, so staffing, internal budget allocations, things like that, is largely unchanged. And that's a real positive thing for the prospects of restoration. You'll also recall when I presented the budget allocations that Congress did not reduce its allocation to Fulbright as a whole in fiscal year 2021, which is also important. Another theme outside the nitty gritty, and I think this is something some of our panelists will touch upon, is about Fulbright advocacy as a broader chance to strengthen US-China people-to-people exchange. You know, there are other US-China exchange programs authorized under the Fulbright Hayes Act of 1961 that were canceled by the Trump administration. Fulbright China is unfortunately not the only one. There are also programs like the Peace Corps, for instance. And we're more generally at a time of great government-to-government tensions between the US and China. So I think it's as people who've been able to participate in person-to-person exchange through Fulbright, or have an interest in person-to-person exchange, how can we think about how these kind of channels can serve as a ballast in these times? So with that, I'm going to turn over to our panelists to start speaking, and we'll first begin with Haiqing. So Haiqing, take it away.
Great, thank you, Ned. So when I first heard about the executive order, I was certainly very shocked. That it contained determination of the China Fulbright program, because it didn't fit what I thought was the purpose of the EO. I didn't, at the time when it first came out, it was kind of a, not something that people really talked about. And I was wondering what I could do on an individual level to kind of at least spread awareness of the issue. So at least for me, I started to gather a group of Fulbrighters I knew, because I was working in China for about 6-7 years, and knew previous Fulbrighters when I started in 2006 till 2012 and later on. I organized just a group of folks through email just to spread awareness about the issue. We talked about various and brainstormed various ways in which we could, at least spread awareness and affect change on the issue. So we talked about options about op-ed, long form content through media sources. We had media contacts. We thought about congressional outreach, and we just kind of tested the waters to see what would work. What was really interesting is I just want to give a shout out to Colleen and Gia and Jay, some of the very active members in my group, that kind of further explored certain areas, especially on the congressional outreach side. And, I thought that was really great, because, we just knew that the Fulbright impacted our lives, and, and made such a big difference, and it would be such a shame to terminate this program and just cut down on engagement. So I personally also had a chance to connect with other Fulbright groups through Slack and other channels, and that's how I knew about the Fulbright Lotus, Fulbright Fulbridge, and all the efforts that's being done in terms of spreading the change.org petition and really consolidate efforts. Now, from my perspective, what I thought was very impactful was one of the fellow Fulbrighters that I knew, Sophie, invited me to a podcast called New Voices. And that is a podcast that amplified women voices in China. And specifically, we had a podcast discussing about determination of the Fulbright. And also the fellow panels, as you can see on the screen, Mega is a acclaimed journalist from BuzzFeed, and actually highlighted issues on Xinjiang, about some of the internment camps that were happening there. The Fulbright was, prepared her for having the critical language skills and all of that. Other folks on the panel also did tremendous work on women organizing and other civil rights matter. So being able to spread the word to see the power of Fulbright is just really, really great. And we were able to actually recruit Elizabeth, who's one of our panelists today, who was a very, very critical person in our advocacy effort, to at least know about the issues, and that there's other organizing efforts that were happening. And so, next slide, Ned. I think that the main point I wanted to mention was the power of advocacy. Don't underestimate the power of one individual and grassroots effort. We were able to garner so much attention in various sources, as our panelists will talk about, because of just the passion to restore the program. Utilizing tools for organizing, really Slack, email, things can happen very fast, and spreading the word through various mediums, whether it's podcasts, op-eds, Instagram, Twitter, websites. These things do work. And just know that the power of just sharing your narrative, and even now, even if there's opportunities for you to share your Fulbright story, can create awareness of issues and can influence key decision makers. I think that folks in Congress and elsewhere, they do care about these things. And so please do keep sharing your story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haiqing. That was wonderful. Let me turn next to Mark, who's going to talk about his experiences with op-eds on Fulbright China.
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Like many of you, I woke up to the news of President Trump's decision with a lot of disappointment. I mean, I thought there was a lot of lack of thought. Like Haiqing, I agreed it didn't make really sense with the rest of the executive order. And for me personally, I had just spent an entire year in Macau and Hong Kong, witnessing both political strife with the Hong Kong protests, as well as talking with the people and really integrating myself into the culture there. So I've been asked to talk about my experience with op-eds, and I just want to kind of preface it by saying I'm not a professional writer. I don't really have a politics background. I just kind of use writing as therapy almost. When I get really upset or angry about something, I tend to just like scribble it down in a dull, angry haze, and that's what happened. I wrote something, and I think it took me like 40 minutes. I was just angry. I just put down my thoughts, and at the end, I was like, okay. And then I just kind of something I'd done in the past and something I had learned in college from a very helpful professor of mine is, try to if you do something that you think is meaningful, try to spread out in the world. So, I sent these to a bunch of different news publications, some national, some regional. I sent to some of my friends. And I was really lucky enough that someone from the South China Morning Post, which is the national newspaper of Hong Kong, responded very quickly and asked to say if they would publish it. So you can see that's in the middle there. And I want to say that I think that sharing your personal narrative is incredibly important. And a lot of people, when they ask me, oh, I'm considering, writing something, but I'm not sure if it'll get published, I'm like, my opinion is just write it. Because even if it doesn't go out in the world, even if no one else sees it, it is a form of therapy and a way for you to process the world around you. As Haiqing mentioned, through a group of WeChat and through this kind of collaborative group that formed organically from all the Fulbrighters, I paired up with different groups of people who, like me, were not professional writers, not politics, and we just started a writing group of, writing down our feelings, writing down our narratives, and we actually had, quite successful stories in publication. I want to point out on the upper left, Amanda Schmidt. She is a professor of geology at Oberlin. Again, she has no professional writing background, no experience with writing to this kind of audience, and her story and her narrative was very impactful. I think if I have any helpful tips or anyone who might be interested, it's really that, write what you see and write what you think. The situation in Hong Kong, even now, is incredibly unstable, both in regards to COVID, in regards to relations with the US. And for me, I don't have a policy background. I didn't want to get into that nitty-gritty of it, especially with the national security law. So I really just wrote about the people that I met. And I want to remind all the listeners here that the Fulbright works both ways. It's not just US higher education students and professors who go to China. It's also Chinese students who go to the US, oftentimes for the first time, to engage with American culture. And that program was also terminated. So talking with a lot of people from Hong Kong about, the disappointments and the lack of opportunity is really what encourages me to continue advocacy in this light. I'll send it back to you, Ned.
Amazing. Thanks so much to Mark for sharing those op-eds, and also both his work and also the work of some of the other attendees on this call and people who've been interested and been getting involved. I think we've had a really great crop over the past 6 months or so of people putting their voices out and adding to that chorus. So I'm going to turn next to Kurt Mosser, who's a Fulbright research scholar in Suzhou in 2019-2020, and he's also been involved in writing kind of work, but from a different angle. So Kurt, please come and share your story.
Okay, this will be fairly brief, especially because Amanda's on here and she's become famous suddenly. I'm feeling a little guilty because the first paper I gave at Suzhou University was called "Is Donald Trump the Worst President in the History of the United States?" And then suddenly bad things started to happen. I hope I'm not responsible. Well, we had a WeChat group of a bunch of us who were in China for the most part, a couple people in Singapore, Malaysia, maybe one in Cambodia. And all of us were having a great positive experience. We didn't want to leave, and we were told, sort of like the old bartender saying at the end of the night, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. And so most of us were really disappointed. We started talking about putting together a set of essays, which we then did. And we have about 20 essays describing research or teaching or research and teaching experiences, how that went, the Fulbright experience, and then how that was interrupted by the COVID announcement. Some people stayed and went to other countries. Some people just gritted it out and lost all of the rest of their money. Some of us just skedaddled home. But all of us had different responses, and Amanda and I collected a bunch of these, and I was hoping to publish it with an academic press, either here or in Europe or in Hong Kong or Taiwan. Sent out a lot of book proposals. No one was particularly interested because I don't think they thought they could make a lot of money off of it. So Amanda and I are in the process of putting it together as a self-published book on Kindle. It'll be available at Amazon, and you have a wide range of people's experiences with the Fulbright and how positive that experience was, and of course in the response to COVID. I've been trying to think of people that I met during the last year and a half who had anything negative to say about the Fulbright. I couldn't think of any. I'm sure there are some out there. But the book is just full of various perspectives on how valuable the Fulbright program is for us to understand other cultures, and particularly the culture of China when we're at such a difficult point in that relationship. And with the change in administration, I think a lot of us are perhaps optimistic that that relationship can improve. So about April 1st, under my name or the very famous Amanda Schmidt's name, you will see on Kindle a very cheap book of essays that focuses on Fulbright experiences in China and a little more generally in Asia. And I hope that people can use it as a tool for somebody who wants to read an essay or a set of essays or the whole book about what those experiences were and how they were extremely valuable. So look for it April 1st under my last name or her last name. I don't think we have a title yet, or I would tell you what that is. And I'm sorry I don't have a cool slide to share, but I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Kurt. Yeah, like that, you gave us a slide of the mind, and I think that looks like major kudos to you for getting it over the finish line, or getting it to, having a date for getting it out. And I think it's going to be really exciting to get to read that. So thank you for you and your work on that. I'm next going to move to Elizabeth Lynch. She was a Fulbright China student researcher in Beijing in 1999 to 2000, and she's current founder and editor of China Law and Policy. Elizabeth, can you tell us about what you've been doing on the Fulbright stuff?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I just want to thank Fulbridge and Fulbright Lotus for hosting this today, and for everybody coming out to hear about this issue and what's happened to the China Fulbright and Hong Kong Fulbright programs. So as Ned said, I was a student just recently graduated from college, a Fulbrighter to Beijing in 1999, and that was actually the first year they ever had the post-BA, the post-college graduate program. So they never had that before. And so as a result of that, it was like put together very quickly. But also once we got over there, being the first program that was straight from college, you really got to see the diplomatic purpose, not just the research aspect. Like we did do the research aspect to the best that we could at that time, but you really got to see how important the program was to the U.S. Embassy and to U.S.-China's relations, and how you'd be called upon to go to events because it was a new program in the Fulbright catalog. And, I didn't go into academia. I think a lot of people and a lot of the advocacy that we've seen in the Fulbright community to restore the program is from a lot of China historians and China academics, which is great and really, really necessary. I ended up going into law, and as Ned said, I ended up doing legal services in New York City for a number of years, and now I work for state government, also serving New Yorkers. But the Fulbright has always been important to me because I've just felt like the investment that the government put into me, like I want to give it back to the community. And being a legal services attorney, a government attorney in New York City, I have that opportunity in serving as this cultural bridge to the Chinese speaking communities of New York. And I like to think that I've used that Fulbright to help people in New York City. And so when I heard that the program was cut, I also was shocked, and I immediately thought, like, what could I do about it? And I have this blog, China Law and Policy, and I thought, okay, I should write something. And again, I'm not a writer, just like Mark, and I just keep the blog because I kind of enjoy it, and I kind of like staying on top of China. And so, but to write the op-ed, I had seen a lot of the op-eds that were out there. I wanted to write something that had a little bit more data in it. And being an attorney and an attorney who works in legal services, so that means you often are opposing the government, even when it is a democratic administration. I had a lot of experience drafting what's known as Freedom of Information Act requests. So I was really curious, like, who put this into an executive order that has nothing to do with international exchange, that had to do with the deteriorating human rights and freedoms in Hong Kong? And why did anybody think this was really, like, cutting the Fulbright was a good idea? So I immediately did what's known as a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of State, because I wanted to see what data I could get. Doing this before, I knew I probably wouldn't get data in enough time to write the article, but it is something that that when I do get that data, I am going to use it and publish it and see. So I want to remind people that if you're going to do advocacy, one tool is a Freedom of Information Act request. You can only do this for government agencies. You can't do it, unfortunately, for the White House. Otherwise, I would have done that. And so I'm still waiting on the information, but basically I'm trying to see, like, how did the Department of State react? Is there anything in emails or communications that says why this was put in there? But in addition to that, another important thing when you're trying to get data about something that your government has done is that a lot of times the government will, the government press person will actually respond just to an inquiry. So I reached out to the Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, which is the Bureau and Department of State that runs the Fulbright, because I wanted to get more data about the amount of money that was being spent, the reports that weren't up on the website, and they actually gave it to me right away. So I think a lot of times when the government does something that you're like, whoa, that really sucked, you think you're in opposition to the government. But there's a lot of actually committed civil servants within the government who will respond to you more quickly than a FOIA request, because they know you can get this information through the Freedom of Information Act. I might as well give it to you. I've shared my FOIA letter with the Fulbright Lotus. I'm happy to send it around if people ever want to do a FOIA letter. It does take a lot of time, so if you can reach out to somebody in the department, that's also good as well. The other thing I want to talk about is just like another thing that we did was to create a web page or a website to house a lot of the important information that you're collecting in your advocacy, just to put out there. Like, maybe it doesn't go in your op-ed, but maybe it's going to go in somebody else's op-ed, right? Like, so I got all the way back to 1970, the annual reports from the Fulbright, from the Department of State. So those are all up on my website. If you want to read them, they can. And so, but we also collected all the articles and op-eds that people have been writing in support of bringing back the Fulbright, people tweeting about the Fulbright. So we have this now all on a single web page. And when we talk to policymakers, we can highlight the important things and then send them to that web page so that way they can explore alone on their own what they're interested in. And then the other thing I would just like to mention is, working with others. As Hai-Ching said, that there's a lot you can do as an individual, but also just as grassroots efforts, working as a group. So we, as a group, have reached out to other organizations. As Ned had mentioned, there was the current budget bill now has a restriction on what on whether or not Fulbright can terminate another program. So because of the spotlight that we've brought to the issue, and because of working with an ally organization who had connections on Capitol Hill and somebody in the Appropriations Committee, they were able to kind of talk to them and advocate before them. And now there's much stronger language in the budget bill for Fulbright, basically stating that before there's any substantive modifications, which include downsizing, suspension, or termination of a country's Fulbright program, they have to consult with the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so even though that hasn't brought back the China program, it will be important in the future in hopefully ensuring that Fulbright doesn't become a political program, which was never its intent, and isn't used by administrations for their own short-term policy goals. So that was another thing. And then the final thing is just, working, like, you can do some stuff on your own, but definitely the power of your voice just becomes a lot louder when you work with a coalition. And you feed off of each other's energy, you feed off of each other's ideas, you feed off of each other's contacts. And it has been like a really awesome experience. And I'm gonna turn it back to Ned with that, because I think James is going to develop that a little bit more. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for sharing all the different very creative ways that you thought of attacking this issue. Things like FOIA, using what you know. It's a good example, and it's a real, I think, ChinaLawandPolicy.com, for those of you guys who don't know it, go there. It's the best one-stop shop out there for, a lot of things, but in this context for Fulbright, sort of understanding why to save the China Fulbright. So I'm going to go lastly here to James, last but not least. James is one of the Fulbright grantees to China, Hong Kong, Macau, who was affected by the termination, redirected. He's going to be going to Singapore in July 2021, but originally would have been Fulbright Hong Kong, and he has stuck with the advocacy since then. So James, can you talk a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ned. So I've, like Ned said, I'm new to the Fulbright community here, and I also do want to say it's been really an honor to work with everyone here. And I'm new, but it's a really tremendous community, and it's been fabulous working with everyone on this. So I was involved with the, in one way or another, on the activism efforts, really since one of the early Slack channels got started, and then a little bit later on, Colleen O'Connor, I see Colleen here, shout out to, Colleen invited me to a meeting with the House Committee on Foreign Affairs to sort of give my perspective as someone who had been very much affected by the termination. There was a kind of a tight-knit group that emerged from that meeting that has carried on this work through the fall and even more recently in the winter. And I thought I would talk about just a couple of high-level takeaways that I've had from this, because I, like Mark and Elizabeth, consider myself in this category of doing something in this without really having previous expertise in politics or lobbying, really. So there's people on the call, there's a lot of smart people here. I'm sure those of you who have a proper political science background can elaborate on a lot of these things, but I did spend some time in the public policy school when I was in grad school, and a couple of things from that stuck. So just thought I would talk about that here. So this is a diagram that looks, I think it's a little bit obtuse and academic, because it came from an academic environment. But I think there's a couple of very practical things about this that are helpful. So in thinking about restoring the program, I think one thing that helped us a lot was articulating a very specific goal. And so that's articulated here in this kind of arc off to the top right, President Biden signing an executive order, not reversing the entire executive order on Hong Kong normalization, but reversing the specific section, which was 3I on the Fulbright. And with that, the specificity of that goal, I think, was something that we articulated via feedback that we were getting over time, and I think led us to engage certain organizations in a way that was much more productive than, I think, our original goal. Not that it was wrong, but we sort of started off by saying something like, we want to restore the program, which is correct, but achieving this level of specificity through various, through getting critical feedback was really important. And I guess I won't go through specific examples on each of these three kind of arms, but this is just to say that, if you can imagine our group kind of in the bottom left of this diagram, and what we want to achieve through lobbying the executive branch, which lobbying the executive branch is a lot harder than lobbying the legislative branch. So there's a huge gulf between those things. And I think three really critical concepts in spanning that gulf are, engaging different organizations, nonprofits, think tanks, that kind of thing. Being careful about timing outreach to those organizations so that feedback from some groups makes, leads to better work that is then used for outreach to other groups. And then Elizabeth talked about allies and the importance of reaching out to allies. And I would also add that it's also important to understand the other side and to try to put yourself in the shoes of the people who might have supported this order. And we spent a lot of time thinking about ways in which we could, it's not as simple as the Republicans don't want the Fulbright and the Democrats do. It's not all that black and white, but given that Trump was a Republican, we spent more time thinking about how to make the argument to the right side of the aisle, let's say. And I think that helped us a lot. And hopefully we'll go a long way towards ensuring more of a continued bipartisan support for the program. You can go to the next slide, Ned. This is just very quickly a snapshot of our to-do list at some point in late October, just wanting to point out the fact that this is a ton of work, and there were many people working many hours a week, not getting paid on this. And I think it was so much work, we stopped filling out this crazy spreadsheet, but there's a lot of really good energy in this group of people. So I wanted to figure out a way to illustrate that somehow. So you can go on to the next slide, the last slide here. So here, I think, and this is my last slide, but just want to step back and think about, so the other thing I'll say too is that I had a call with someone from the State Department this morning, actually, and they did want to convey that they are going to be undertaking a series of reviews of all of President Trump's policies, including this one. That is underway now and will take some time, given that Secretary Blinken was just confirmed. But that is something that's going to be happening. So I think in general, we all feel fairly optimistic about the program being reinstated, actually. We don't know that for sure. I think we'll have to revisit that in maybe in a month or so if it doesn't happen, and think about things we need to do. But assuming that the program does get reinstated, I think that given that we have a lot of energy and a lot of capacity as a community, I think that there is an opportunity to think about ways in which we could harness some of our energy towards other goals, not just reinstating the program. This diagram, again, is I won't go through every single aspect of this, but the idea here is that longer term change is best done in an environment where you have very capable leaders and very capable society. And so I don't want to make assumptions, but I think most people on this call, most of us who have done the activism work, fall into the category of civil society. I mean, we're doing this on our own time and just as members and individuals in the Fulbright community. And so I think that you know, there's a lot of smart people here, and I think we have a real opportunity to think about where this could go. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Ned.
Amazing. Thank you, James. Thank you for that recap. And I think that's a good transition for us to get into the Q&A. We have about, so we scheduled here through 9:15. I know obviously we're coming up on top of the hour. Some people may need to move along, but we would love to give a chance to have a broader discussion about, you know, what's the state of play right now and how can we move forward, and then to answer some of your questions. So I'll have a few notes here, and then I'm going to get into some of the questions that we've gotten. So first, you know, we've gathered here to discuss advocacy around Fulbright China, and on that right now we're just over a week into a new administration. We've done a lot of work. Different people have done a lot of different work in a very decentralized and exciting and energetic way over the past several months, but with the new administration and this way in which the ball is sort of in their court, you know, we're just still waiting to see how they're going to react. But we can certainly continue to keep some of that engagement and pressure up, so to speak. So keep this thing as a active topic of discussion, circulating the restoration position on change.org that went out over the summer, you know, writing op-eds, using our social media channels and personal connection to keep visibility on this up. Second, we've touched on some important issues about the long-term future of the Fulbright, and I think that this is a broader set of discussions, or two kind of broader discussions coming out of this. One is about, you know, how can we strengthen the legislative protections around Fulbright China so that something like this doesn't happen again for Fulbright China or to other programs as well. Elizabeth mentioned that in Congress's latest appropriations bill, termination will require prior consultation notification. You know, what about making that a formal separate part of the Fulbright-Hays Act itself instead of just an annual budget rider that can get changed? Or what about reinvigorating the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board? I think I mentioned that they haven't published an annual report since 2016-17, and you know, without those annual reports, both Congress and the public at large is in less of a position to perform their oversight responsibilities. And then I think on a bigger picture, again, broader U.S.-China people-to-people exchange. People exchange is a really important ballast in this time, and I think that we can, you know, just in the same way that we've had energies around Fulbright China and the role that Fulbright China and Hong Kong and Macau can play in people-to-people exchange, there are other channels where we can apply that energy as well. So I am going to turn to questions now. I'm going to invite people to speak here who've raised questions in the chat. Thank you for sharing those. And we've got a group of questions about Fulbright China, or sort of the Fulbright program itself, and then also some questions, some bigger geopolitical questions as well. And I want to be able to get to some of both of those. I'm going to start with the Fulbright specific questions. Adriana Nelson, do you want to ask your question to the panel? Let me
back up and see what I asked.
There you go. No worries.
Okay, where the heck was that? All right, yeah, here it is. Okay, so I think all I asked was, would requesting to speak for the Congress on the issue in particular be an option for efforts to reinstate the program? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. Who on the panel would like to take that? I think James or Elizabeth.
Could you say that one more time? Sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
To any one of the panelists can answer.
So Adriana's question was, would requesting to speak before Congress on this issue in particular be an option for efforts to reinstate the program? What's the role of congressional lobbying, do you guys think?
I think the feeling, others can chime in, but I think the feeling is that the easiest way to reinstate the program is for it to be reinstated through the executive branch. And if that doesn't happen, then we might need to revisit the strategy and see if there's a way to do it through the legislative branch. But it would be a lot, I don't know, it would be very complicated, I think. It would be a much different path forward, because essentially it seems like it would have to come forward as a bill that like enshrines these kind of programs and say, which would be great. I mean, it would be amazing to have protection for this and other programs written into law, but that doesn't exist now, and I think would be an effort that would go way beyond Fulbright China. So, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's great, James. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for jumping in on that. And maybe I can also turn then to Jesse's question. So does anyone know? And I think that this has been discussed in the chat some. But Jesse, do you wanna ask to the panelists as well?
Sure. My question was what we know about the Chinese side and whether they would be willing to resume the program if America sorted out our stuff over here. Would they just kind of pretend that none of this ever happened and continue on as normal, or would there be a use of maybe somebody in there wants to save $1 million and just make America angry? I don't know. Is there anybody has any information on that? I'd love to hear. And also, we could cover maybe what we've come up with in the chat about a potential angle into the executive branch through Kurt Campbell.
Would anyone like to jump on the question about the Chinese side? Elizabeth, James?
Yeah,
Anybody else?
so we have through allies, so we ourselves don't have direct contacts with the Chinese side, but through allies that we work with, other organizations that are in more contact with high-level Chinese sides, and also with people we've talked to at Department of State. The Chinese side, I think their understanding is that they're confused. They didn't understand why the United States would cut a program that kind of serves more the US side. There's actually a great article by a Chinese sociologist about the Fulbright program for Chinese Fulbrighters coming back, and it has actually less prestige than their own traditional, their own homegrown programs for studying abroad. So our understanding is they're confused, but that it would probably be able to get back running because the government organization that handles other educational exchanges. So it's not like that's been dismantled, but there doesn't seem to be any, there might be some hard feelings and just confusion, but there doesn't seem to be any signals that they wouldn't restart it. And if anything, I think James found a Global Times article the other day that he sent around to some of us, just where they assumed this would be what Biden wanted to do, and in a very un-Global Times way. They didn't say anything nasty. So it's
been a while since we got good news from the Global Times,
So I think those signals and what we've learned from allies signals that it shouldn't be a problem on the Chinese side.
Okay, that's all good news, And then I had a question also, it was maybe started by my question, but I want to make sure that we can kind of approach it in here. Janet had suggested, Janet Upton, by the way, Fulbright mama from my time, suggested that Kurt Campbell might be an avenue that we might be able to approach, who is, he's going to be the White House czar, and I believe we have a former Fulbright, somebody said, who's going to be in working with Kurt in that position. So maybe, I don't know, Ned, I don't know if this has been, you guys have been aware of this for a while, or what, I guess, what can we do as people to kind of help figure out to make sure this all goes in the right direction, as people who are hoping to, be of help however we can?
I think that's a great question, Jesse. And I do think the thing on Rush Doshi, thank you to Cecilia for bringing that up in the chat. So Rush has been he actually, he was in Yunnan before me in a similar program to me several years before me. He's been at, I never crossed paths with him. He's been at Brookings, China since finishing a PhD, or sorry, at Brookings since finishing a PhD and working on their China programs, and has also worked very closely with Kurt Campbell for some time at this point. And so certainly, I think, to the extent that I don't have sort of personal connections to Rajoshi, but it is the sort of thing where, Brookings has said in a report, they said some positive things about restoring Fulbright. I think maybe some panelists might remember who was on that report. I don't recall whether Rush was involved in that one, but certainly, you know, if there are people who sort of know Rush, he was from the 2011-2012 cohort, you know, it would be, I think, really worthwhile to just, you know, check in with him and find a way to share some of the cost benefit stuff and see what they're thinking, just to make sure that it's, you know, on their mind. Does anybody else have anything on to add? James Eggers also had some interesting questions about whether cuts or effects on other kinds of grants. James, did you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. James Eggers, Brazil 2012, just very interested in China, kind of passion project of mine. I had two questions. One was more geopolitical in nature, kind of at a macro level. How has Hong Kong's diminishing financial importance to China impacted the United States' approach to diplomatic relations with Hong Kong and China at large? And then the second, more Fulbright specific, is with the drop-off in disallowing grants to China and Hong Kong, has there been an uptick in grants to, you know, quote, allied nations in the Pacific area? Thank you.
Those are good questions, James. I may be able to chip in at least on the second question, but I want to open it to the panelists first and also encourage people, anybody who, you know, we've got a lot of really good talent on this in the audience right now as well. So if you have some thoughts that you'd like to share on that, please do unmute and speak up. But first, panelists, do you all have anything, or did I can actually perhaps make some inferences about the second question. It's not a specific question that I've followed necessarily very closely myself, but I can say that there has been, within the region, within Southeast Asia, there has been a bit of, there's not been the sustained attention to Southeast Asia within the Trump administration that there was during the Obama administration. Actually, you know, I mean, a sort of a dark, but I think a telling example was that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the U.S. ambassadorship to Singapore has been unfilled for the entire administration. There was no U.S. ambassador to Singapore. Singapore is a very important ASEAN state. We should have an ambassador in Singapore. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So, you know, that kind of coordination of this activity with other sorts of strategic aims is something that, you know, I can't say that I haven't looked at the specific issue to say whether to say it confidently, but I can certainly say that the broader picture of the coordination of China policy with other Southeast Asia policy, at least, has been somewhat limited. And yes.
Sorry, I just said jump in. I can answer the first part of the question and maybe elaborate a bit on the second as well. I think I interrupted you. Sorry.
Please do. No, I was done.
Sure. So regarding the situation last year, what happened was people who were in Hong Kong and Macau, the Hong Kong program actually ended before all of this happened, before the executive order, due to the protests, and several of the grantees were actually given the opportunity to relocate to different areas in the Asian sphere. So Taiwan, Vietnam, for example. I will say that if you look at just the number of grantees that are given, the US doesn't have any preferential treatment per se, but there are much more established ties with, for example, South Korea or Taiwan that have bilateral commissions, which are established groups that are designed to help, you know, maintain the longevity of the Fulbright program. In regards to your first question about, you know, the current situation in Hong Kong and financial means, so I would argue that while China is trying to, you know, centralize the entire country, including, you know, outlying places like Hong Kong still has a major financial kingpin role in China's plan and economy. And you can see that, you know, a lot of the retaliation measures between China and the US still are financial. So, for example, Carrie Lam, who is the chief executive, says that she has to get paid in cash because she can't open a bank account due to, you know, potential sanctions. So you can just imagine her in her house, you know, with stacks of bills, which is a fun image to think about. But in regards to other, you know, issues, it is very retaliatory in measure. So it's a tit for tat. After the U.S. sanctioned a lot of Hong Kong employees, including Carrie Lam, China did the same. Well, Hong Kong and China did the same with people such as Pompeo. I can say that in terms of the Fulbright program in Hong Kong, Macau, I personally am a lot more pessimistic than perhaps some of my other panelists are. The Hong Kong America Center, which is kind of the IEE equivalent in Hong Kong, actually dissolved shortly after the executive order came out. And due to the kind of geopolitical tightrope that they play, ETAs in Hong Kong and Macau are actually directly employed by the schools that we work at. None of the money comes from the U.S. government. It's mostly assistance by nonprofits or the embassy if it has to. So talking with administrators there, because I'm very interested in getting those programs reestablished, they believe the timeline is more going to be about potentially 2 to 3 years before it's considered again, if not at all.
Mark, thanks a lot for that contribution. It's really helpful to have your voice as someone from Fulbright Macau with a background in the Macau-Hong Kong circumstances, which sounds like maybe different in important ways from the China circumstances. I wanted to move next to Benjamin Lee, who had a question. Ben, do you want to unmute and share your question?
Yeah, it's partly a question, it's partly a comment. So my name is Ben. I did my Fulbright back in 2017, 2018. Spent some time in Beijing and then Nanjing. And right now I'm actually in DC working at a think tank. And I just want to offer DC's perspective on US-China relations more broadly, and perhaps why I think it might be a little harder in terms of reinstating the Fulbright program. So the mood is very bad, as everyone knows. US-China relations has deteriorated so significantly to a point where I just have a very hard time seeing how this is going to move forward. And with specifically to the Fulbright program and more broadly in US-China relations, the ideological dimension has become so tense. The State Department designating Xinjiang as genocide, arbitrary detention of 2 Michaels from Canada, and it's just been really hard for me to interact with quote unquote the China hawks, and many policymakers in DC basically questioning the value of engagement. Their basic argument is engagement's failed. And to a certain, based on my anecdotal evidence, talking with people about my Fulbright experience, some of them even interpret that as me turning a blind eye toward a more repressive China. And as much as I appreciate sharing the personal stories and the value of the Fulbright program as well as my experience, I just don't know what's the best way to move forward our argument in this very hostile political climate without appearing tone deaf. Yeah.
That's a very good question. Oh, go ahead, Hai-Cheng. Yes, please.
Yeah, I can make a comment. I think that, I think it's easy to be pessimistic, but at the same time, I think there's ways of framing the narrative in a way that makes a lot of sense that there should be, more engagement, right? Part of the cost benefit analysis that this group has also done is really showcasing that we need to be involved and engaged with the world and with China from a national security perspective, right? And so I think that there is, I think that the framing we have to be careful about. Yes, I do think that this is a time where US-China relations is at slowest, but I think that, it is undeniable that China is a force to be reckoned with. And, we do need to, as a nation, just think about how we can engage in whatever capacity, right? I think there's a lot of damage that has been done, but I don't think that, I think that we do still see some bipartisan support. They might not all put their neck out there per se, but I think that we are hopeful that the Biden administration will kind of see the positive side of some of further engaging in a constructive way.
I would just like to add, along with Ben's pessimism, which I think is probably well placed. While I hate to sound cynical, when we think about engaging with China and talking to people who are either liaisons or intermediaries or various people, it's always good to keep in mind to couch some of these things in terms of what's in China's self-interest. Every now and then, China seems to act in its self-interest. And one of the ways we might be able to think about this is to remember that perspective. Why would it be to China's advantage to have this program reinstated?
And then I'm not one of the panelists, but could I make a point in terms of the pessimism problem? Because I'm sure we're all dealing with it.
Absolutely, please do.
I feel like, you know, I do comedy, and that's what my relationship to China is doing comedy with Chinese comedians. And in the comedy world, the comedians in China are still interested in learning about American comedians. And I'm sure we all had a subheader to what we were doing our Fulbright research in, or what we found as our interest in Chinese or Chinese culture. And my experience has been outside of like literally politics. Most of the other fields that people have been in still want to communicate with each other. So the artists I know in China still want to talk to the artists in America, and vice versa. And I'm sure in many fields it's the same way as well. So a lot of times what I found is when the politics has been completely blocked to me, and that's been so outside of my personal ability to impact anything, I've kind of returned to the subheader, the subspecialty in which I engage with China. And in that area, I've been able to make a lot more progress than in trying to push the political boulder up the hill. So
just if I can just add some positivity, following up on Jesse's kind of positivity. You know, I do think like in researching the Fulbright and the origins of the Fulbright, like a lot of people don't talk about this, but it was actually like really created for world peace. It wasn't created, like every time Senator Fulbright talked about the program, he talked about the US bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he never wanted to see that again. And he never wanted to see people to people be like governments take advantage of people's ignorance and creating hatreds amongst people in different countries that could lead to another global war, because that war would have a destruction that we wouldn't be ready for now that everybody is a nuclear power. So I do think like, I know the Fulbright program has become this strategic thing for us getting information, and we can't avoid that, and that's what it is often a selling point. But it is about democratizing international relations and actually taking it out of the government sphere, where people get to know other people in the hopes that, and maybe this is naive and stupid and it never will work, but in the hopes that when you know another person in another country, you will ask your government not to drop an atomic bomb and avoid a war. And so you know, so I do think like there is something to that, and just the democratizing, like it isn't for our government to say we shouldn't have it. It's for us to say we shouldn't have it, because that was the purpose of it. But I think strategically, I mean, the other great thing, and this goes to Kurt's comment about, you know, does China want it back? Is it in their interest? Luckily, the Trump administration went really big in cutting a lot of programs to China, not just the Fulbright. Pompeo also cut these congressional trips to China. And I actually think the Chinese government really cares about those, because that's a way for the Chinese government to actually influence policymakers. And those programs are actually also under the Fulbright-Hays Act. It's a different type of program. It's not a Fulbright-Hays, but it's also under that 1961 Act. So in a way, strategically, that's something I do think China wants back, and I do think Congress wants back, because they like those trips, right? So that's another. So I'm remaining optimistic. I do recognize that we are in some of the worst China-U.S. relations in a long time, but I think Hai-Ching's podcast on New Voices, somebody talked about how even when the Soviet Union and the U.S. were in a very low point, we instituted a Fulbright program, right? Like we recognize that maybe that's important to get us out of this situation that could lead to war.
And I just want to add to this too. There's a lot of things that you can do in your own power to kind of improve U.S.-China relations, right? Like I think Jesse has done it through comedy and has been such an advocate for that. And I think that in my space, I'm in law, but I also I do a lot of privacy work for Coursera. And I myself know a lot of Chinese lawyers like in China and who are doing a lot of work in privacy. And I've actually told them that they should influence their privacy practice. They should, talk with law. They should figure out ways in which they can exercise their influence. And shaping those policies to make it more business friendly for US businesses. And so I think that there's like many ways in that you can try to do in your areas that you'd be surprised that just like that civil society engagement is actually quite important. And so I think that, yes, there's many things to be negative and pessimistic about, but I think that, we should try to think about, okay, what can we do in our capacities to move things forward?
I want to jump in here, not because, just because we're at 9:20 and I know that we had held to 9:15. So just to recognize we're a little bit over time, but I also feel bad because I think we've got a really great discussion going on. I do want to have direct to one question here to sort of, I think I'm going to be kind of a closing and a next steps kind of related question that Brian Sway had. Brian, do you want to ask your question for the panel? And then I think we could wrap up that way.
Hi, yeah, I feel guilty for asking a question, but I'll try to keep it short. So James Carrico had a really sophisticated graph at the very end of his presentation. If you could go back to that, Ned, that'd be really helpful. And it was kind of like clarifying for me and sort of elucidated a lot of not only the progress, but also sort of projections toward the future. And so you kind of left off on this note of sort of there are other goals, and then it ended what you were saying. And so I was just sort of wondering if you had anything specific in mind in terms of where this graph is showing us and going, and also what sort of just specific things you had in mind when you sort of left off on the idea of future goals and other goals too. So that's my question. And any panelist can answer that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, it was meant to be open-ended. But I guess, and maybe I'll put this to Elizabeth, because I think, so, well, two things that have come up on this are in terms of other longer term goals other than reinstating the China program is thinking about ways in which we can strengthen the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, and that, has a lot of different connotations to it, but I'll just leave it at that for now. I mean, Elizabeth, I think, brought up the board hasn't produced a report in the past 3 years. It's made up of people without experience in higher education, so on and so forth. And then the other one being, do we want to try and think about some kind of broader legislative protection for programs like this, beyond the language that's in the appropriations bill? So that's two things that I think there's a lot of dimensions to both of those. It's complex and would probably benefit from a dedicated group of people working in a Slack group for many months working on those like we've been doing. Yeah, so those are two specific things that came up, and I'm sure there's things beyond that too, but I don't know if anyone else wants to, any of the panelists want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, James, for bringing those both up. And I think that those are big picture questions that I think are important for us to think about, because there is a way in which, there's a real, I think there's a really valuable discussion to be had about how we can take some of the energies around Fulbright China and maybe, first let's get that program back, and then hopefully also, and we can continue to sort of think about how do we keep that program back as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody again for coming this evening. I feel like we've touched on a lot of really great issues, both in the discussion and also in probably the liveliest chat that I've ever been involved in on a panel. Watching it happen was so great. The points. Thank you, Janet, for participating and joining us again as sort of a Fulbright legend. Interesting points from David, from John, also from Mia about Confucius Institutes. From Cecilia, Jesse. This was really wonderful, a great discussion. And please follow and look up on the socials for Fulbridge and Fulbright Lotus. And we're going to distribute these slides as well. But also, if you want to get involved more in this information or in this work about Fulbright China's restoration, and especially as we see how the new administration approaches this issue and whether they're moving as fast as we want to, please join our Slack group. If you haven't joined Slack, I didn't join Slack. Elizabeth had never been in Slack before. A number of us had never been in Slack until we joined the Slack group. It's great. So there's a QR code here, and we're going to circulate a link after the panel as well. That's a centralized hub where we can have a lot of these discussions and set up times. We had a petition that a lot of credit to Fulbright Lotus in particular for getting it out back in June. And so put your name on that. We got 2,400 signatories. Let's get to 2,500. Let's get even more. And then here's also contact information for the panelists if you'd like to reach out to people individually. So thank you guys again so much for attending. Thank you to our great panelists for today. And I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thanks for moderating, Ned.
Thank you, Ned. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Ned.
Ned, and the panelists.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Ned, correct me if I'm wrong. Are we not doing the kind of informal like hangout discussion afterwards, or?
Yeah, I think at this point, yeah, we've gotten to a stage where, yeah, I think we had sort of been thinking of it as a Q&A.
Okay.
So yeah, apologies. I should have been clearer.
No,
on that.
no worries.
Yeah,
it's a shame.
how...
That was what we're looking forward to the most.
No worries. Sorry about that. Apologies.
No worries. I think we got most of the questions out. So
yeah.
Thank you for planning this.
Absolutely. Thanks for participating, Mark.
Yeah. Do you want us to send out like other contact info of yours for like more informal stuff beyond your email, or?
I think I give my email to Ned. I don't really have any other social media platforms. So I'm sure interested people could reach out.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Right.